I had a strong reaction to that part of Hillary Clinton's remarks, when she called Trump supporters deplorable and irredeemable, and that irritated me because I was a teenager in the 90s, and I remember the super predators thing, and I remember the Clinton administration, and I remember Bill Clinton turning the execution of a black man into essentially a campaign prop. So if it was remarkable to me that she would say something like that about other people. It was really condescending, and also I felt wrong, because I do think that people can change. I think that people are capable of being better, and I think that while the essay is a strong case for the inevitability of history affecting the present, that people can make different choices, and people can decide to reject the politics of white identity. And I think that we'll see whether the nation is capable of it, but I certainly don't think it's inevitable that this is how our politics are going to be forever.
Our guest today is Adam Serwer, senior editor at The Atlantic, covering politics. He previously worked for BuzzFeed News, MSNBC, Mother Jones, and The American Prospect. And he is here with us today to talk about Donald Trump and race in America today. He wrote an absolutely exceptional long essay for The Atlantic in November on this topic. And I'm just going to open by reading to you two passages that stood out to me from that piece. The first, 139 years since Reconstruction and half a century since the tail end of the civil rights movement, a majority of white voters backed a candidate who explicitly pledged to use the power of the state against people of color and religious minorities, and stood by him as that pledge has been among the few to survive the first year of his presidency. Their support was enough to win the White House and has solidified a return to a politics of white identity that has been one of the most destructive forces in American history. This all occurred before the eyes of a disbelieving press and political class who plunged into fierce denial about how and why this had happened. That is the story of the 2016 election. That the legacy of the first black president could be erased by a birther, that the woman who could have been the first female president was foiled by a man who confessed to sexual assault on tape. These were not drawbacks to Trump's candidacy, but central to understanding how he would wield power and on whose behalf. Americans act with the understanding that Trump's nationalism promises to restore traditional boundaries of race, gender, and sexuality. The nature of that same nationalism is to deny its essence, the better to salve the conscience and spare the soul. Since you wrote this, Adam, how has the conversation changed, or how was it received? Like, this was almost 5 months ago now.
It was actually pretty well received. I was somewhat surprised. Mitt Romney's former campaign manager, Stuart Stevens, shared it on Twitter, which kind of shocked me. But I think there's more or less, I think people are, the mainstream media consensus is more or less approaching, if not my tone of description, the basic underlying tenets of that description. There was a piece by Ashley Parker in the Washington Post where Senator Bob Corker, he was quoted saying something like, it's a tribal thing. And I think people who start using language like that get very close to the actual words one would want to use to describe Donald Trump's ideology and the appeal of it. So I don't know how much of that has to do with me or how much that has to do with events. I think a few months ago when the president described his preference for immigrants from Norway rather than immigrants from African and Hispanic countries, I think that laid things out fairly clearly, both about how he views immigration and how he views the people who are descended from those countries who are here now and are citizens. So, I think I would like to think that the piece had an impact. I'm not sure how much of an impact it had. But I think it's certainly the case that events are shaping people's perception of this in a way that is piercing the clouds of denial.
One of the points you make in the piece is that we understand racism as almost an interpersonal failing, or as about language, rather than being about systems of power, and rather than being about policy.
Yeah, I think there's a great example of that today. I believe Mitt Romney, who's looking at a Senate run in Utah, said something like, I'm more right-wing than the president on immigration. I think the DACA kids should all be deported. And it sort of makes you think back to when he was railing against Donald Trump during the primary, and it's like, well, what were you objecting to? Were you objecting to his mean language? And I think in some ways, I think a lot of people think of racism that way. It's a mean thing you say to somebody. It's a slur. It's a naughty word. But what it actually is power. It's the power to shape certain people's lives because of the groups that they are perceived to belong to.
You open the piece really looking at David Duke, and the David Duke, in 1990, almost or a little bit more than half of the Louisiana electorate voted for him, and
the white Louisiana.
The white. Sorry, yes, correct. Thanks. Important correction. The white electorate, a little over half of the white electorate in Louisiana voted for him as governor, and
Senator.
Senator rather. I'm undercaffeinated today, and how the press really, in seeking to cover that race and understand the appeal of David Duke, talked about economic insecurity, and that in the media narrative around Trump's victory, we've returned to that again.
Right. So I think the nature of American politics is always to want to hold white people blameless when they act out of racism. So, in the case of Duke, I mean, the reality is that in the 1990s, if it had been up to the white people of Louisiana, the state would have sent a Klansman to the U.S. Senate in the 1990s. That's just the reality. And I think, faced with that, I think the impulse is to say we can't really be that terrible, and so you have to find sort of some rationalization, some explanation for why what is happening in front of your eyes is not actually happening. And I think that same impulse was at work with Donald Trump's candidacy, where people were sort of, particularly his voters, who I interviewed dozens and dozens of them during the campaign, and they were all very much in denial about what Trump was saying, even though they sort of endorsed the underlying policy prescriptions he was offering. Much in the same way with Mitt Romney, the Mitt Romney example that we just discussed, they seemed to think that the problem was his tone of voice or the language he used, and not the things he was actually proposing.
And how do you see your peers in the media? How do they grapple with this? Why are they so quick? Why is it so hard to confront the kind of painful reality of American history?
Well, look, I think that as a journalist who's allowed to express, I work for a magazine. Magazines are traditionally more receptive to reporting that takes a viewpoint. For my colleagues who are in the newspaper industry or in broadcast, they often have to figure out where the line is that they have to toe as far as appearing fair to both sides. And I think that's extremely difficult in the Trump era, where the two sides to each question the idea that there's two sides to each question can sometimes seem ridiculous, right? I mean, the president is denying that he had an affair with Stormy Daniels while trying to enforce a non-disclosure agreement about the affair. Like that sort of paradox of I'm telling you that the sky is green is difficult for journalists to deal with, because journalists want to be reluctant about saying that someone is lying because you can't be inside someone's head. At the same time, we're in an era in which rank dishonesty is a very typical aspect of covering the Trump administration. And I don't want to exceptionalize Trump too much. All governments lie, all administrations lie. It's part of the job of journalists to sort that out. But it's a little different when the lying is sort of to this degree and at this level where it's about things that we can plainly see are not actually so.
And when you think about that in the context of race, here's an administration saying they're not racist, or the EPA Administrator Pruitt saying diversity is not important.
That was Zink.
Zink. Interior Secretary, and yet the president is saying he only wants immigrants from white countries.
Yeah, I think
predominantly white.
I think another aspect of this is that the press is largely white. They're people who have close personal connections to Trump voters. They don't want to think of their friends and relatives and people they have close personal relationships as being as having what is perceived as this incredible character flaw. And so I think it's easier for people to sort of tell themselves that that's not what's going on, as opposed to just saying straight out what it is. And I think that's partially why you see a big distinction even among objective journalists. You see a distinction in the way Trump is written about from journalists of color than you often do with white journalists.
Well, tell me more about that. How would you describe that distinction?
Well, I don't want to call anybody out in particular, but I think there's an awareness there's awareness of explicit subtext with journalists of color, where we're cognizant of the fact that Trump is talking about us and people like us in a way that I think is easier for white journalists to dismiss.
Do you think that's part of why there's this narrative about the white working class, that class becomes a convenient almost scapegoat to avoid confronting race?
So I want to distinguish between two things, between the idea that the white working class is suffering and the idea that the white working class suffering is the explanation for Trump. So I think there's no question that in a country like ours, where almost all of the wage gains of the past 30, 40 years have accrued almost entirely to people at the top of the income scale, that people below that, particularly people in the working class or poor, are struggling. The question is, to what extent are you willing to buy into a solution to that problem that blames other people for that problem on the basis of race? So the willingness to ascribe that issue to black people who don't want to work, Latino immigrants who are stealing your jobs, so on and so forth. And I think that we have to be really careful about class because of that, because it's one thing to say that explanation is insufficient for describing the rise of Trump, and it's another thing to say that these people aren't dealing with some very serious problems. That said, I think that the working class explanation, while there was a significant movement of downscale whites to the Republican column in the last election in a way that we didn't see when Mitt Romney was running, for example, that explanation is insufficient because people of color of similar class backgrounds did not like those solutions, and they didn't like them because they were targeted by them. So it's not sufficient to say, this is a class issue. You also need to have an ideological lens through which you're viewing your problems in order to ascribe them to other people in that particular way. So even if someone who is like a black steel worker and a white steel worker, they might view Trump differently, and they're going to view Trump differently because their ideological orientation towards what Trump is selling is going to be different.
What you actually write a bit about this, about I'm going to quote from your piece again. The nature of racism in America means that when the rich exploit everyone else, there is always an easier and more vulnerable target to punish.
So the explanation that the example that I used right before that was the draft riots during the Civil War, which for those of you who don't know about that, the Irish working class of New York engaged in a horrible, essentially a pogrom against black residents of New York, killing women and children, and they were reacting that way because of a draft law which allowed rich people to buy themselves out of the draft. So it was virtually assured that the white working class, aka in this case the Irish, were going to bear the burden of going before Confederate guns. Now that is a completely legitimate objection. Like there's no question that the Irish workers of New York City were right to be angry at this draft law that exempted the rich from sacrificing for their country. On the other hand, their decision to react to that by murdering black people in New York City was abhorrent. And the fact is that that's how racism works when in the United States. When the rich exploit the poor and working class, quite often the white poor and working class decide to take out what power they have on the people who are even more vulnerable than them, which are the people of color in the working class. It's one of the great tragedies of United States history, honestly.
How does that play into the calamity thesis?
So the calamity thesis in my in the essay is the idea that there's some unspoken calamity that hit the white working class and caused them to want to vote for Trump. And ultimately, I'm unpersuaded by that, in part because the economic factors that affected the white working class affected the black and Latino working classes even more deeply. And there was no corresponding drive towards extremism. Like, after the recession, you didn't see the, Nation of Islam membership suddenly swelling as a result of, black wealth being systematically destroyed by unscrupulous banks. And so my basic argument is that, this idea that it was outsourcing or it was the opiate epidemic, this idea of a calamity that struck white America and that made them want to vote for Donald Trump isn't really accurate, except to the extent that the election of Barack Obama crystallized a number of ideological trends on the right, fear of Muslims, anti-immigration, and anti-blackness, that essentially radicalized a large portion of the white population. And to the extent that there is a single proximate cause for Trump's election, it is the election of Barack Obama.
You called birtherism in your piece one of the most important political developments of the past decade.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it first came out as a conspiracy theory, it was sort of a joke, right? I mean, it seemed like such a far-fetched nonsense thing, but what it really did was synthesize all these strains of bigotry that would eventually, I mean, it's basically a thesis statement for Trumpism, right? Muslims are bad, black people are bad, immigrants are bad. And somehow Barack Obama was, in this fevered imagination, all three. So in a way, he kind of embodied the sum of all these fears that were bubbling and manifesting on the right. And the result is simply that the result is that the candidate who embodied those fears won the election and won the hearts of those people who had spent the last 8 years essentially experiencing the last 8 years as a kind of psychic wound to their pride over the person who was in the White House.
And what one of the things you write about in the essay is about the role of in looking at the calamity thesis. Another kind of frequent argument or thread heard in the media was that there were a lot of people who voted for Obama who then voted for Trump, so therefore they can't be motivated by racism.
Yeah, I mean, look, the way that racism works, it's very easy to find an exception to the rule and decide that you're okay with that person even if you're not okay with those people in the aggregate. And Barack Obama was the exception of exceptions. I mean, they're to the extent, it's very possible, there's no contradiction in thinking, having negative views about black people and voting for Barack Obama because, quote unquote, he's one of the good ones. It's something that if you're black, you've absolutely heard a million times before. So I think, that's a really, the idea that racism doesn't always control voting behavior. There are other things, there's a lot of different factors that go into why people vote the way they vote. And this is one of the reasons why I argue in the piece that white identity politics are not insurmountable as a political force, because people can decide to vote for other reasons even if they are racist, or based on other things even if they are racist. But it's really facile to say because someone voted for Barack Obama that they are incapable of racism. I think if liberals made that argument in 2009, conservatives would absolutely laugh them out the door. And so I'm not sure why that explanation seems to have a great deal of appeal now. So those voters are possibly convertible for the Democratic Party going forward, but it's certainly not the case that they are immune to holding racist views simply because they cast a ballot for a black person.
To what extent, a lot of your recent reporting has not been about race at all, but has been about Trump and Russia, and to what extent do you, how do you understand race as an undercurrent to all of the reporting about this presidency?
Well, I don't want to get too, I don't want to put too much of the race stuff on the Russia stuff, except to the extent that I think, the entire Russia investigation is a series of behaviors that Barack Obama could absolutely never have gotten away with. And the extent to which we are, and when I say we, I mean the country generally is willing to accept behavior from a white person that they would never accept for a black person. I think that's something that you're seeing in the Russia investigation.
But I guess I'm not just interested in Russia. I'm interested in, central to your argument in this essay is that Trumpism is really understood as a kind of white nationalist worldview and ideology. And if that's the case, something you argue in this piece is that a year in, pretty much all his promises have been broken except the ones that are rooted around white identity. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering then that's not how the White House is generally covered by the bulk of the press corps. That's not how a lot of his appointments and the policy approaches, I think, are being seen. And so, to what extent does the press corps need to more directly confront the role race plays in this administration?
Like I said, it's very difficult for newspaper reporters and regular broadcast reporters to deal with this stuff in a straightforward way because of the conventions of objective reporting in the United States. But I think, they almost, I'm not sure that they need, my concern is that they not deny it, less than that they explicitly set it out for people. That's the job of people like me who are allowed to insert our opinion in our journalism. But to the extent that, the truth is that Trump is doing it himself with his headlines. He's doing it when he calls for, NFL players to be fired for protesting police brutality. He's doing it when he articulates his preference for white immigrants from Norway. He does it when, he neglects to help Puerto Rico in the midst of a horrifying national disaster, and then lectures them on their national debt while doing everything he can to help Texas. Objective journalists don't necessarily need to do what I do. My criticism of them and my criticism of some of the coverage of the campaign was the extent to which they spent a lot of time essentially attempting to pretend that what was the case was not the case.
A lot of time, let's be explicit about it, a lot of time trying to pretend that this was about a calamity, whether it's joblessness or opioid.
I think there was a framing of stories, and even in objective journalism, framing is extremely important and involves a particular perspective or point of view. I think the framing of this election was that it was a rebellion of the working class, and that's just not, the story is just much more complicated than that, obviously.
What was the hardest part about writing this essay?
I guess writing it. It took me a long time to write. I started reporting it in October of 2016, and it didn't get published until November of 2017. So it just a lot of the reporting was done within the first few months of writing it, but after that, I spent a lot of time doing historical research and reading and just sort of trying to get my head around the class-oriented argument for Trump's candidacy in a way that would allow me to like confront the particular arguments that were being made about how exactly this whole thing came to be. I think, in particular, the David Duke thing was sort of, there's a book by David Roediger called The Wages of Whiteness about the formation of the white working class. And the David Duke thing came up because he had some sort of throwaway in his intro complaining about Marxists who analyze race solely through the lens of economics. So he was talking about how during David Duke's governor's race, there was a commentator on the Today Show who said something like, oh, well, Louisiana has a very high poverty rate as a way of explaining why people were voting for a Klansman for governor. And he said, well, as Marxists, our economic analysis should be more complicated than what you see on the Today Show. And I was struck by that, and I was like, huh, that's really interesting. And then I started reading about Duke's Senate race, and I basically saw, I saw the exact same lines almost verbatim being used to explain Duke's candidacy that were being used to explain Trump's candidacy. And in particular, I found Trump opining on Duke's appeal, 30 years, 20 years before he would say he didn't know anything about David Duke at all.
What surprised you in the reporting out of this story, in either the interviews or in the historical research? What was?
I think the Duke thing surprised me. It was actually pretty shocking it was like deja vu to be reading essentially the same phrases, the same arguments, the same framing over and over again, with something that had happened in Louisiana 25 years ago. I suppose, there wasn't anything, I think I did not quite understand the extent to which Trump supporters, I did not understand how they related to Trump's rhetoric on religious and ethnic minorities until I interviewed them about it, until I asked them and I said, so what do you think when he says these things? And they would always say, I think he loves everybody, I don't think he's racist at all, but we need to build a wall and immigrants have leprosy. So, there was a way in which they really did not want to think of him as racist, but they were willing to repeat, whatever he said that was considered offensive in more polite language. But the underlying, but to them, the sort of underlying thing, the underlying idea, there was nothing wrong with it. And I think, it was really important for me to go out there and talk to them to really understand exactly how that worked.
I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience in a minute, so get your questions ready. But to what extent do you think, given the mood of your colleagues in the media and the press right now, I hate to paint them with one brush, but I will. To what extent do you think they're poised to continue to cover the 2020 election or even the midterms around the calamity argument or the economic argument?
I don't think that's going to come up again, but I do think that.
Why don't you think that's going to?
Because it's already been, that story's already been told. There's going to be a new story as far as like a grand narrative around the election. I think the real issue is going to be the Trump administration has shown a lack of restraint when it comes to using the levers of the federal government for political purposes. And I think that it'll be very difficult for the press to deal with that in particular. And there are so many manifestations it can take that I won't speculate. But
give us an example of something you've seen that you think could be troublesome, or I need some frame there.
I mean, there was a for example, there was a Department of Homeland Security report a while ago that said that most terrorism was caused by immigrants, but the way they did that report was by juking the stats so that it removed essentially defined homegrown terrorism by white supremacists as not terrorism. So when you have control of, I mean, the federal government is an amazing repository of official knowledge, and when you have control over those types of things, you are able to manipulate the press in ways that we've seen a million times before. I mean, when you look at the war in Iraq, selective leaks to the press were part of the way that the case for the war in Iraq was built. This time around in 2020, the Trump administration, which arguably has an even less intimate relationship with the truth than the Bush administration, is going to be able to manipulate that official knowledge in ways that I think the press is not necessarily prepared for.
And how do you view the Democrats, the leaders of the Democratic Party, in their response to the white nationalism of Trumpism?
I think the Democrats are in a difficult place because they have to figure out a way to appeal to the broadest section of white voters while also
without calling them racist.
Right. So I mean, this is part of the argument of my piece, is that no one wants to say that Trump is racist, in part because if you do that, you taint his voters, and Democrats who want to reach out to those voters don't want to make those people feel bad, and because otherwise those people might not vote Democratic. So Democrats have to figure out a critique of Trump that brings more white voters into their camp while also not making their Black and Latino constituents feel as though their concerns are being sidelined or dismissed. I think, we have yet to see how good the post-Obama Democrats actually are at politics. And I'm not a particularly good evaluator of political strategy, so, I mean, I don't know.
Let's see, do we have questions from the audience?
Talking about racism, and I'm wondering if you think there's a meaningful difference between calling a person or a politician racist versus calling a policy racist. Do they have different impacts? So in recognition that, of course, calling a Trump racist affects his voters, like you just mentioned, but it also is a non-conversation starter. It usually ends the conversation. But talking about policy, saying, for example, the immigration policy, we want more people from Norway, less people from Hispanic and African countries, that had a little bit more of a traction, a little bit more of a conversation associated with that. So I wonder if you see a meaningful impact, and is that a strategy that you think that people who want to talk about these issues should invoke, or should they focus on calling the person racist?
I mean, I'm not a good person to ask about that because I'm not actually sure how people get persuaded of different things. I think in my experience, it usually comes from having an intimate relationship with someone who can explain it. But, obviously some people react more strongly to being called racist as a person than saying like an action is racist. But, I mean, on some level, it sort of feels like we're splitting hairs, right? I'm not sure that a person who is going to be really offended by being called racist is going to necessarily react better because you said, well, what you just said was racist. You may not be racist, but what you just said was racist. Maybe that works, maybe it doesn't, I don't know. I mean, certainly there are people who argue that that distinction is helpful when talking to those people, but it's not something that I really know too much about.
But there is, but to just take that question a little farther, in the context of how the media covers it, there seems like a greater willingness to engage around the discussion of race and racism in the context of policies or institutions versus individuals.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's related to the fact that, as I write in the piece, a lot of people are a lot more worried about being called racist than they are about racism as a phenomenon. But I think it is a little bit easier when you're talking about institutions, but a lot of people don't actually believe that institutional racism is a thing that exists. They, like I said earlier, they believe that racism is an individual flaw that individual people have, and that those people are few in number. So, it's not really that big of an issue.
Convenient fiction. Another question, yes, Khalil.
This is great, and glad you're here. I'm curious if in the Obama age, either first or second term, you felt more ambivalence about reporting on Black Lives Matter activism and state violence as an institutional problem as compared to the Trump moment.
No, absolutely not. In fact, I think the late Obama administration, I mean, one of the things that is really tragic about the Trump era is that one of the things that the Obama era Civil Rights Division did was it created these incredible documents of official documents of how racism works in America now. So you look at like the report that they did on Ferguson, and basically how there were more outstanding warrants in Ferguson than there were people in Ferguson, and so there was this, and the report described this entire way in which the people of Ferguson, but particularly its black residents, are used as a municipal funding source, and essentially taxed and fined into, you know, unemployability, into not being able to afford the necessities of life, into, you know, being able to be arrested on the street at any given time. I mean, those kinds of documents that were producing paper trails that show how institutional racism works, that was, I mean, as a reporter who writes about that kind of stuff, that was incredibly helpful for like showing people, showing America, like, this is how this works.
That's the point. The question was actually about editorial policy, not about the administration's role in exposing institutional racism. So in other words, so I mean, I've written and had to like prove points that felt more like an expression of the editor's own like discomfort with naming racism than it did with the evidence that I was marshaling to prove the point. So I'm saying, have you seen?
Oh, has it been different now in terms of people willing to describe what it is? I don't know. I think that I think that we were already.
Has it been different in newsrooms, in newsroom culture?
This is about editorial policy.
Okay.
Is it really that bad versus all hands on deck? Of course, racism is now a problem.
I think that is it really that bad lasted until about 2015, and the in particular the writing that Ferguson inspired and the reporting that it inspired and the conditions that people were describing in these cities where these uprisings happened, that I think opened a lot of white journalists' eyes to conditions in poor black neighborhoods, and I think that they, whereas before there was a lot of, we have a black president, et cetera, et cetera. I think that even before Trump, I would say around 2015, summer 2015, was when things really started changing and people started really realizing that the sort of narrative of the sort of tidy liberal narrative of racism, there was terrible racism, and then the 60s happened, and then things were kind of bad for a little while, but we're actually really getting over it, was just far too pat.
Yeah, thank you. My name's Elam. I'm also a student here at the Kennedy School. As a follow-up to that question, you described earlier how you believe that in the 2020 election, the narrative that was written about around the 2016 election will have passed, and there will be a new narrative. The phrase you offered was that story's already been told, and so the press likely won't resurrect the narrative again. Do you anticipate a similar thing happening with what you just described about the press's kind of awakening to the reality of American racism in 2015? That is, do you anticipate that we will move towards a moment in a few years where newsrooms will feel like that story too has already been told, even as it continues to persist in daily life?
I think that there's certainly a case of, I think people do go to sleep on racism, right? I mean, like what it's certainly the case. I mean, you look at the aftermath of Reconstruction. It's certainly the case that predominantly white institutions have a way of closing their eyes to this stuff and then being surprised when they rediscover it again. And I don't see any reason why that couldn't happen again. Is it going to happen this time? I don't know. I think there's a couple of things that are a little different. One is that in a way that has not been true in the past, Black and Latino voters have more power than they used to. And the white people who remain in the Democratic Party are getting more liberal. To some extent, that's liberals getting more liberal. To some extent, it's all the moderates and conservatives just becoming Republicans. But I think it might be harder to go to sleep in part because the composition of the electorate is different. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's happened before. It could happen again.
And certainly black voters decided the Democratic primary to a significant degree. Presidential.
Thank you so much for being here. Your essay was
Thank you.
probably my single favorite thing written about the election.
Thank you.
One of my things I really liked about it is it made the point, and correct me if I'm wrong or missing some of the finer points because it's been so many months since I read it, but it made the point that you can have people who, people have sincerely held beliefs that they aren't racist, they aren't motivated by any kind of like racist power structure, and yet they are. That's what drives their voting behavior. And so it's, it's almost like the metaphor of a dog whistle isn't like the precise way to describe exactly what's going on, because it isn't that there's like something that the rest of us can't hear, the people who are attuned to it can't hear, but that there's, it's tapping into like a substrate of racism that we don't even entirely have a handle on. So I'm just curious, I'm not going to ask you how do you like convince people that that's what's happening, because like who the hell knows, but I'm just curious how you think about that, dynamic, and whether you, in your research for the piece you read any like interesting sociological or literature about the psychology of racism.
Well, okay, so if there's one thing that I think I put in the piece, but in the book, White Backlash, that was about the way that immigration trends. This was written before the election, which I think is really important. It was about the way that immigration trends were driving white people from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. They mentioned that people are less likely to maintain prejudices when they have personal relationships with people from the group. So if the population rises in a state, if the Latino population rises in a state due to and you don't have that contact, the white residents of that state are more likely to grow more prejudice. But if they have personal contact with the group, essentially, if they're not segregated, they're less likely to grow to develop intolerant views for their new neighbors. So I mean, to the extent that there's like hope for this question, I think it really is in desegregation, which is not something that the federal government has been invested in for a very long time. So I don't know. I mean, it's certainly not the case that our politics, the way that they are not inevitable. I would be the last person who would be able to say, what exactly needs to or should or could happen to change it.
So that was a nice sort of segue into my question. My name is Robert Livingston. I'm a social psychologist who studies race, the psychology of race, implicit bias, explicit bias, those sorts of things. I'm on the faculty here. So it's a two-part question. One question, and it concerns her question before, is whether it's productive to talk about these things in terms of racism or not, because it's an incredibly nebulous concept that people don't quite understand and can't agree on, what qualifies as being racism. And in fact, there are studies that show that most white Americans now believe that there's more racism against whites, and I could quote racism against whites in U.S. society than racism against blacks. And when you dig a little deeper, it's because their definitions of what racism is are incredibly extreme, right? Getting back to the pogroms that you talk about, or sort of violent racism of the 17th century version. And that it really manifests itself in very subtle ways that people don't quite label as racism, and the people who perpetrate these actions don't consider themselves to be racist. I just had an interview with a white supremacist, right, for some research that I'm doing, who did not think that he was a racist, right? It was more defined in terms of ideology, and it's like, oh my gosh, and this person actually knows David Duke and claims that David Duke wouldn't think that he's a racist, like he would use another term. Putin wouldn't say that he's a demagogue, right, even if he is. So the second part to that is, would it be more productive to define actions, policies, behaviors in terms of anti-racism versus non-anti-racism? Because that seems like that's something that's a little easier to put a finger on. You clearly can't be an anti-racist and vote for Donald Trump. maybe you're racist, maybe you're not, and that's not the question. But in a system like a river that flows, if you jump into the river and you do nothing, you're going to be carried downstream, right? And so are people behaving like salmon, right? In order to get to where you're going, you're swimming against the current, and is that maybe what we need to focus on in terms of affecting social change in a pragmatic sense?
Well, I mean, I again, I don't know what could be done to help. I'm sorry to be bleak about that. I just don't. But I do think that, it's important to say the people that I interviewed, most of them, the people who I interviewed who voted for Trump, they consider themselves anti-racist. They think racism is bad. If you ask them about it, they will tell you that. And the issue is that they will say that, and then, as you pointed out, I am not surprised at all that you interviewed a white nationalist who's like, well, I'm not actually racist, because it's like this weird paradox of the civil rights movement, right, where it's made racism such a bad word that not even the racists want to be called racist.
To quote the president, I'm the least racist person
Right.
you know.
But that's I don't think that, as far as descriptions are concerned, I don't think we should allow that kind of delusion to force us into elaborate end runs around what it is we're actually saying, which is that this is racist. And I think, whether or not, I mean, it's certainly true. I know what surveys you're talking about. I mean, I've certainly seen them. Even the fact that a majority of white voters think that there's more discrimination against white people than anybody else is a manifestation of racism. And I think, I don't think that not using the word racism is going to make us better able to describe that phenomenon.
Catherine Hoover Ashbrook, I run a program on diplomacy here at the Kennedy School. Adam, I read your essay with such interest, in part because it goes against what people in my profession, political scientists, have been trying to pull across the board when they think about populism. Because the calamity thesis was then used all over Europe in the same way to say, oh, look, yes, it's all linked to globalization, the losers of globalization, fine, we can, made all the comparative political scientists happy because you had something to go with. And part of the reason I read your piece so closely and with such fascination is because I've always thought that actually that doesn't bear out across the board. And we have to be very careful when we look at the individual versions of populism across Europe and here to not lob everything into one and then to try to, again, focus on somewhat more simplistic solutions. There is, of course, a racial element in the populist narratives right across Europe, from Hungary to Poland and in different other places. But and I mean, the other thing that I found remarkable about your article was that you had done so much background research to prove this out systematically, which I thought was really remarkable. How do you think about that now when you look at this country's situation in comparative context, or if you talk about your colleagues who are trying to cover this from a foreign policy angle, how does that bear out?
I mean, I think the American situation is different because America has had an old unfulfilled promise since its founding that this is a place where we are united by a civic creed and not a nation in the sense of like a people, right? We're not the British people in the same, we're not the Italian people. We're not, we're united by creed and not necessarily language or blood or background. So I think that inherently is different from the populisms and nationalisms of Europe. We have a history of absorbing large foreign populations and turning them into Americans. So I think it's inherently different, right? I mean, when you look at the nationalism represented by Donald Trump has always been there, but there's always been a second nationalism, a second American nationalism that says, we are a nation of immigrants, we come from all over the world, and that's what makes us special. And anybody can be an American. And I have to say, like, I don't think Italy has that. I don't think France has that really. These are a lot of countries in Europe are dealing with influxes of immigration from their former colonial possessions, so that they have been, they have internalized an idea that these people are less than them. And certainly we have a form of that here, but it's in conflict with this other idealized form of Americanness that, whether or not you agree with it, whether or not you think it's authentic, it has certainly always been a part of our national identity. So I think that fundamentally makes us different from a lot of these other countries.
Tom Ashbrook, we talked about your wonderful article on NPR last fall. I'm just interested in what reaction to your article you have found most interesting, most heartening, or most disheartening, and if the current administration is trying to turn back to the old order. Play that forward, Adam. How do you see that playing out over time, that effort?
I've gotten some angry reactions, but the truth is that most of the people who read the whole piece were people who I suppose were predisposed to actually like it or think it was interesting. I think my favorite reaction was there was a young writer at National Review who read a piece that I wrote about the Women's March, and Louis Farrakhan, the leader of the Women's March, had been, the co-chair of the Women's March, had been in a Farrakhan event, and I interviewed her and wrote about the sort of perception of the Nation of Islam within the Black community and why it's a little different from what you see from the outside. And someone said that, I should apply that analysis to Trump supporters, which I thought was interesting. I disagree with it for a number of reasons that I won't elaborate on here, but I think the most heartening thing is that a lot of people from different political persuasions engaged it, whether they agreed with it or not, and they weren't, they were surprisingly, I surprisingly did not get a lot of, people waving their arms in the air and screaming, "You think everybody's racist." I got a pretty good amount of thoughtful reactions, even from the conservative side, which was great. It's a 10,000 word piece. I'm sure I'm not right about everything in it, but I still feel pretty strongly that the thesis of it is correct and that public events since have really borne it out.
And the effort to restore the old order?
Oh, as far as restoring the old order, I think that to a certain extent, it's very difficult for Congress, for the president to do what he wants without Congress. So if you want to cut immigration, you're going to need Congress to do that. If you want to, but there are other things that they can do. They obviously the stuff with booting trans people out of the military. I think when you look at the states and you look at the way that they're handling elections, I think there's a substantial effort to alter the rules of elections so that the Republican Party can, with its shrinking constituency, continue to be dominant in the federal government. You saw this yesterday with the decision in the census, which they claimed was necessary to enforce the Voting Rights Act, which Jeff Sessions thinks is a bad idea, so we all know that's not true, which is in fact a roundabout way of making it so that apportionment in Democratic areas is smaller than it should be. I think to the extent that you're seeing, he can't literally turn back the clock, but to the extent that he will attempt to enhance the power and stature and status of his constituency, I think we are seeing a remarkably sustained effort in that direction.
Hi, my name's Silpa. I'm a research associate at WGBH. Thanks for being here. I had a question. We talked a lot about how media as an institution is sort of ill-equipped to deal with the abnormality of this administration, but there are lots of other institutions that are similarly ill-equipped to do so. I think, in particular, the Harvard Kennedy School. There are people who got appointed to the IOP just because they held prestigious titles, but they behaved in grossly immoral and abused people on tape or lied to the American public with absolutely no remorse for that. But then people like Chelsea Manning were not welcome at the IOP in similar positions. Do you think that institutions like academic institutions are doing their part to sort of disincentivize this kind of behavior? Do you think that they have a moral obligation to do that at all?
I think it depends. I think that depends on how they see their missions. I do think it's the case that, to a certain extent, I mean, one of the things that you're seeing with the Trump administration is that they are having a hard time attracting top flight talent, in part because people don't want to be associated with the administration, and that includes, conservative people who are eminently qualified. So I don't know. I don't know if academic institutions, which are under particular scrutiny right now because of their association with the left, are doing their part. But I do think that there is a general social stigma that you're seeing play out very clearly in terms of people associated with the administration or people deciding not to associate with the administration on the premise that ultimately when this thing is over, it's not going to look very good to have been a part of that project.
Adam, thank you for your time. I have a last closing question for you, which is, I want to ask you about how you close the piece itself. You say nothing is inevitable. No one is irredeemable.
So I think that I had a strong reaction to that part of Hillary Clinton's remarks, when she called Trump supporters deplorable and irredeemable. And that irritated me because I was a teenager in the 90s, and I remember the super predators thing. And I, remember the Clinton administration, and I remember, Bill Clinton turning the execution of a black man into essentially a campaign prop. So, if it was remarkable to me that she would say something like that about other people. It was really condescending, and also I felt wrong. Because I do think that people can change. I think that people are capable of being better. And I think that, while the essay is a strong case for the inevitability of history affecting the present, that, people can make different choices and people can decide to reject the politics of white identity. And I think that, we'll see whether the nation is capable of it, but I certainly don't think it's inevitable that this is how our politics are going to be forever, just because it's the politics of what identity have dominated America in the past.
People can and people do choose differently. Thank you very much, Adam, for taking time out of your busy schedule.
Thank you for having me.